God is a God of abundance. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
Abundant in giving fertile places for people to live in. Abundant in determination to survive in seemingly uninhabitable places. God's people, the Hebrews, were descendants of Abraham, as are the Muslims and the Christians. These three religions believe in one God, the God who called Abraham to leave his country and go to the country that God had prepared for him and his descendants. Eventually, God's people were overrun and enslaved by the Egyptians. Hundreds of years later, the Hebrews were brought out of Egypt, led by Moses, following God's direction. Another Middle Eastern god was named Baal. Baal was observed as the universal god of fertility. This god was also he who rides on the clouds and Lord of the heavens. Another of his titles were Lord of the earth and Lord of the rain and the dew. It was very tempting to follow Baal and other local gods who had been made into images, something to touch, something to hold, something to bow down to. And the God of the Hebrews remained out of sight, but filled every heart. After many generations, God separated these 12 tribes of Israel into 10 tribes, which remained Israel, and 2 tribes who became Judah. These stories are in the First Testament, which is full of stories of war and kings and hatred and death and overcoming overwhelming odds and trusting that God's chosen people would survive and thrive if they follow the rules. You know what the rules are? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself, be humble, don't let anyone be hungry or feel rejected. Don't treat anyone as an alien, but as a revered family member. You are to live as a family, tender, caring, loving, generous. Don't hoard or be greedy. There's enough for all. Now that's a synopsis of the Old Testament. You can read it for yourself. We have bent this rule into many shapes, and perhaps we have completely abandoned or forgotten it. This brings me back to the words of Hosea, the prophet. He speaks in images that humans can understand. Imagine yourself picking up a newborn baby. Remember that? Look at the smiles. When you pick up a newborn baby, the first thing we do is touch its hair, smell its head, feel the baby squeeze our fingers. And Hosea says that's the intimacy that God feels for God's people. Even those who rebelled, even those who followed idols, even those God cannot and will not forget. How does one forget the tenderness of a newborn babe? That's the tenderness the prophet Hosea puts in the mouth of God. When God's people wandered in the desert for 40 years, the people had to depend on God for daily provisions for 2 or 3 generations. Yet, when the Israelites became a settled nation, they became greedy. Just like the other kingdoms around them. They planted crops, they planted vineyards, they established cities built by slaves, surrounded by soldiers who would keep the city safe, and there were huge storehouses for the food, for the royal family, for the soldiers, for the priests, and the slaves. The other 97% were on their own. But the people offered obeisance to the gods of crops, the gods of warfare, the gods of wealth and health, and anything else they could think of. So what's a prophet to do? Hosea the prophet points the people back to the God of their ancestors, the God who called Abraham to leave his country, his relatives, his father's house, to go to a land of blessing. The prophet Hosea reminds the people again and again of the God who loves and shows mercy and brings sustenance and has been cast aside. The more God called out, the further the people ran out of earshot. In the prophet's words, God reminisces about teaching the people how to walk, embracing them with open arms, healing them when healing was needed. God says, I led them with cords of kindness and bands of love. But perhaps the people mistook the cords and the bands as tools of bondage rather than connectors to infinite mercy. Yet God continues to love. Now Jesus, God with skin on, speaks about greed also, as Hosea did. Jesus reminds his listeners, watch out for greed. Greed that comes from having far too many possessions. If anyone wants to consider whether they have too many possessions, start now. There will be another rummage sale next year. There's a high bar to pass, and don't overdo your Christmas shopping. It's only 142 days till Christmas. So we all have possessions. Maybe we don't need more Christmas gifts. We all have possessions which can control us. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
And too many possessions are to be avoided. Possessions can blind us to the needs of others because we want to hold on to what's mine. Now, when we try to explain that to 2-year-olds, we say that's not nice. But it's perfectly sane for adults. Like the man who needed to build a bigger barn, we count on our possessions for security, which can keep us from seeking and depending on God's abundance. Theologian Elizabeth Johnson writes, "The rich farmer is a fool, not because he is wealthy or because he saves for the future, but because he appears to live only for himself, and because he believes he can secure his life with his abundant possessions." Did you notice when the rich man talks in the parable, he talks only to himself, and the only person he refers to is himself? The rich man's land has produced abundantly, yet he expresses no sense of gratitude to God or to the workers who helped him plant and harvest his crop. He has more grain and goods in storage than he could possibly ever hope to use, yet he seems to not have thought of sharing it with others, and no thought of what God might require of him. Our reality is that no matter how much we have, we are always aware of the things we don't have. Can I get an amen? Amen. We are bombarded by marketing wizards whose job it is to convince us of all the things that we need to complete our lives. We never feel like we quite have enough. Like the rich farmer, we're tempted to think that by saving large amounts of money and having many possessions, we will be secure. But sooner or later, we learn that no amount of wealth or property can secure our lives. No amount of wealth can protect us from disease, from a tragic accident, from a shooting, or from death. No amount of wealth can keep our relationships healthy and our families from falling apart. Look at the brothers fighting over their inheritance at the beginning of this gospel story. Jesus repeatedly warns that wealth can get in the way of our relationship with God. We need to demonstrate with our lives how God lives in our lives. It's about how we invest our lives and the gifts that God has given us. It's about how our lives are aligned towards others, towards God's mission to bless and redeem the world. It starts with a smile. Really? Have you gone into Walmart and smiled at people?
Yes.
Yeah. It starts with a smile. That's the generosity of sharing God's love. A smile. Did it cost you anything to smile? Did it hurt? All right. Perhaps we are all fools because our lives need to be accounted for at some point in time. Our ideas of not enough can narrow our outlook to the destruction that we have caused worldwide. It can narrow our vision of our neighbor and narrow our ideas of God. Our needs can be met, like the people in ancient Israel, like the man who needed a bigger barn, but we too hold on to our ideas of scarcity in a land of wealth. Is our love of God greater than our love of our possessions? I struggle with this. Amen.
Amen.